At 7:42 on a Monday morning, Daniel stared at the number on his laptop and checked it 3 times. $18,640. That was the amount he had earned in the previous month. A year earlier, he would have thought a number like that was life-changing. Now, something strange was happening. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't even smiling. He was nervous. His first thought wasn't, "What can I do with this?" It was, "What if this doesn't last?" Daniel closed the laptop. He went to the kitchen, made coffee, and spent the next 20 minutes scrolling through his phone as if the number he'd just seen didn't exist. 3 months later, he made an even stranger decision. He turned down a contract worth more than his annual salary. The client wasn't asking him to do anything illegal. The work wasn't impossible. He had the skills. He simply looked at the size of the contract, felt his stomach tighten, and convinced himself that he wasn't ready. Nothing dramatic happened. No alarm went off. Nobody stopped him. He just said no. And that tiny decision points towards something most people never hear about when they're told to make more money. Sometimes, the hardest part of getting more money isn't earning it. It's becoming comfortable enough to keep it. Because your brain doesn't care about becoming rich in the way you think it does. Your brain cares about something much older: safety, familiarity, predictability. And when a person's financial life suddenly moves far beyond what their brain considers normal, more money can feel less like freedom and more like danger. Daniel hadn't always been afraid of money. When he was growing up, money was discussed carefully in his house. Bills were paid. Food was on the table. But expensive things were different. His parents didn't talk about investing. They didn't talk about building wealth. They talked about surviving. If someone bought a luxury car, his father called it wasteful. If a neighbor renovated their house, his mother wondered how they could afford it. When Daniel wanted something expensive as a teenager, he heard the same sentence over and over. "That's not for people like us." Nobody meant anything cruel by it. It was simply how his family understood the world. There were people who had money, and there were people like them. Daniel carried that idea into adulthood without realizing it. He worked hard. He learned valuable skills. He eventually started making more money than anyone in his family had ever made. But his internal picture of himself hadn't changed. And that's where things get complicated. Because your brain doesn't build its idea of normal from spreadsheets. It builds it from repetition. If you've spent years seeing $3,000 a month as normal, $10,000 can feel strange. If $10,000 becomes normal, $30,000 can feel almost unreal. The number itself isn't the problem. It's the distance between the number and your identity. You can know intellectually that you deserve more money and still feel uncomfortable when it actually arrives. That's why two people can receive the exact same opportunity and react completely differently. One sees possibility. The other sees exposure. One thinks, "This could change my life." The other thinks, "What if I mess this up?" And neither person necessarily understands why. There is another reason this happens. Your brain is constantly trying to predict what comes next. That's one of its most useful jobs. When your life is familiar, your brain doesn't have to work very hard. You know how much you usually earn. You know what kind of restaurants you can afford. You know what happens with people you spend time with. You know what happens when the bills arrive. You know what happens when you look at your bank account. Then suddenly, your income doubles. Your options change. Your social world can change. Your responsibilities change. And your brain has to rebuild its prediction of reality. For some people, that feels exciting. For others, it creates a quiet form of anxiety. They start asking questions they didn't have before. What if I lose it? What if people find out? What if I make the wrong investment? What if my friends think I've changed? What if my family expects something from me? What if I become the kind of person I used to judge? So they do something that looks irrational from the outside. They pull themselves back. They spend more. They quit too early. They avoid taking calculated risks. They keep their income low enough to feel familiar. And because these decisions usually happen one at a time, they don't recognize the pattern. Nobody wakes up and says, "Today I'm going to sabotage my financial future." It happens in smaller moments. A person gets a raise and immediately upgrades everything. A freelancer finally has a great month and starts spending as if the income is permanent. Someone receives a large payment and leaves most of it sitting in a checking account because investing feels too complicated. Another person gets a chance to start a business but keeps waiting for the perfect moment. 6 months pass. Then another 6. Nothing changes. The person tells themselves they're being cautious. Sometimes they are. But sometimes caution is just fear wearing a respectable shirt. And fear has a very interesting relationship with money. Losing $1,000 can hurt more than gaining $1,000 feels good. That isn't because you're bad with money. It's a deeply human tendency. The brain treats loss as something that needs immediate attention. When money disappears, you notice. When money quietly grows, you may barely feel anything. That's why someone can have a portfolio growing for years and still obsess over a temporary drop. The gain becomes background noise. The loss becomes an emergency. Now increase the numbers. A person who has never had $100,000 may feel incredibly uncomfortable watching $100,000 move around in an investment account, even if the investment is sensible, even if the person understands the numbers. The emotional response can still be completely different from the intellectual one, because suddenly, the money represents something much larger than money. It represents what could be lost. And the larger the amount becomes, the more powerful that feeling can become. This creates one of the strangest financial traps. You work incredibly hard to reach a level of wealth you've never experienced. Then, when you finally get there, you become afraid of losing it. So you stop taking reasonable opportunities. You stop learning. You stop investing. You become defensive. You spend your energy protecting what you have instead of building what comes next. And sometimes that protection becomes the very thing that keeps you stuck. But there's an even deeper layer. Money doesn't only change what you can buy, it can challenge who you believe you are. Suppose you've always been the person in your family who struggles, the person who understands what it feels like to count every dollar, the person who knows how to find the cheapest option, the person who doesn't ask for much. Then your income changes. Suddenly, you can afford things your family couldn't. You can travel. You can live somewhere different. You can say no to jobs you hate. You can walk away from situations that once felt impossible to escape. Sounds great, but psychologically, it can create distance. And humans don't always like distance from the people they love. Sometimes becoming wealthier creates a strange kind of guilt. You start wondering whether you're leaving people behind. You might even hide your success. You don't mention what you're earning. You avoid talking about investments. You keep driving the same old car long after you can afford another one. Not because you don't want anything better, because you don't want to look like you've become someone else. That's the part nobody tells you. Financial growth can require an identity change. An identity change is uncomfortable. Think about the first time you walked into a room where everyone seemed richer than you. You probably noticed things you didn't consciously mean to notice. The way people dressed, the cars outside, the way they talked about vacations, the restaurants they considered ordinary, the price of things nobody bothered to mention. At first, you might feel like an outsider, but spend enough time there and something interesting happens. The environment starts becoming normal. The expensive restaurant doesn't feel expensive anymore. The business deal doesn't sound outrageous anymore. The six-figure salary doesn't sound impossible anymore. Your brain adjusts. This is one reason environment matters so much. What feels enormous in one environment can feel completely ordinary in another. And that can work in both directions. If everyone around you believes that earning $5,000 a month is unrealistic, you may unconsciously treat that number as a ceiling. If everyone around you talks casually about building businesses, investing, negotiating salaries, and owning assets, your brain receives a different message. Not necessarily that you're guaranteed to become wealthy, just that wealth is possible. And possibility matters, because people rarely move toward things they believe are completely outside their world. Daniel eventually discovered this himself. The contract he'd rejected months earlier came back around. Another freelancer took it. Daniel watched that person's business grow. At first, he felt jealous, then embarrassed, then angry. But eventually he realized something uncomfortable. The other freelancer wasn't dramatically more talented. They simply had a higher tolerance for uncertainty. They were willing to sit with the discomfort Daniel had been running from. That changed the way he looked at his own decisions. He started reviewing every financial choice he'd made over the previous few years. There were patterns everywhere. Whenever his income increased, his spending increased. Whenever an opportunity became serious, he delayed. Whenever he had more savings, he found a reason to use them. Whenever he lost money, even a small amount, he became extremely cautious. None of those decisions looked crazy on their own. Together, they told a story. Daniel didn't hate money. He was uncomfortable with what money represented. Responsibility, uncertainty, visibility, change, possibility, and maybe most importantly, freedom. Freedom sounds wonderful until you've spent your entire life learning how to survive without it. Because freedom means you have choices, and choices create responsibility. If you have no money, some decisions are made for you. You take the job because you need the paycheck. You stay in the apartment because it's what you can afford. You can't invest because there isn't enough left. You don't have to wonder whether you're making the perfect decision. The circumstances decide for you. More money removes some of those limits. And suddenly, the decisions are yours. That can be liberating. It can also be terrifying. This is why some people unconsciously create financial problems right when their lives start improving. Not because they want to fail, because failure is familiar. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar success. That's a strange sentence. But watch how people behave. Someone who grew up around financial instability may feel strangely calm during a crisis. They know what to do. Cut expenses, work more, borrow money, delay the purchase, find another job. But give that same person a large amount of money and ask them to manage it for 20 years, and suddenly they feel lost. There is no emergency, no obvious problem, just responsibility. And responsibility requires a different kind of confidence. Not confidence that you'll never lose money. Confidence that you can survive a mistake. That distinction changes everything. Because the goal isn't to train your brain to believe that you'll become rich and never experience setbacks. That's fantasy. The goal is to become comfortable enough with money that a setback doesn't immediately send you back to old habits. You don't need to stop caring about money. You need to stop treating every financial decision like a threat to your survival. And this is where the idea of a personal money ceiling becomes useful. You may have an amount that feels psychologically comfortable. Maybe it's $5,000 in savings. Maybe it's $20,000. Maybe it's $100,000. Once you reach it, something happens. You relax. Then you spend. Or you stop pushing. Or you convince yourself that you've made it. Then the number falls. You work hard again. You rebuild. And the cycle repeats. The ceiling isn't always a specific number. Sometimes it's a lifestyle. You earn more, but somehow never feel richer. Your income rises. Your expenses rise with it. A bigger apartment, a better car, more subscriptions, more expensive vacations, more convenience. Nothing looks reckless, but somehow there is still never enough. That's because wealth and income are not the same thing. Income tells you how much money comes in. Wealth is what remains after the money comes in, and what that remaining money can eventually produce. Your brain, unfortunately, is much more interested in immediate rewards. A new car feels real today. An investment that may grow for 20 years feels abstract. A vacation creates a memory now. Saving the same amount creates a future possibility you can't see. That creates a constant battle between the person you are today and the person you might become later. And the present version of you has a voice. It's loud. It says, "You worked hard. You deserve this." Sometimes that's true. But another voice is quieter. It asks, "What would happen if you kept the money instead?" That question doesn't feel exciting. It feels boring. And that's exactly why building wealth can be so difficult. A lot of financial progress looks painfully ordinary. Keeping expenses under control. Investing consistently. Waiting. Learning. Saying no. doing the same sensible thing when nobody is watching. There is no dramatic moment where you suddenly feel rich. The bank account grows quietly. Then one day you realize you have options you didn't have before. You can leave the job. You can help someone. You can survive an emergency. You can take a month off. You can turn down a bad deal. The money has changed what your life can withstand. And perhaps that's what your brain has been trying to understand all along. Big money isn't just a bigger version of small money. It creates a different psychological environment. The decisions get larger. The mistakes get larger. The opportunities get larger. And your old habits don't automatically disappear just because the numbers in your account changed. That's why earning more isn't enough. You have to expand what feels normal. Not overnight. Not by pretending you're already wealthy. Slowly. You let yourself see bigger numbers without immediately reacting. You learn how investing works instead of avoiding it. You practice keeping money instead of finding reasons to spend it. You spend time around people who treat financial growth as ordinary rather than impossible. And you start noticing the little moments when your brain tries to pull you backward. The moment a bigger opportunity makes you uncomfortable. The moment you receive more money and immediately want to get rid of it. The moment you think, people like me don't do things like that. That's the moment worth paying attention to. Because sometimes the sentence isn't really about money. It's about identity. And identities can change. Daniel eventually took on another large contract. This time, he didn't feel fearless. His hands still shook a little when he signed it. He still wondered whether he'd made a mistake. But he didn't run. The money came in. And instead of immediately changing his life, he left it alone. Some went toward taxes. Some went into savings. Some went into investments. And some he spent. Not because he was afraid of money anymore. Because he had decided where the money was supposed to go before it arrived. That small difference gave him something he'd never had before. Control. Not control over the market. Not control over the future. Control over his own reaction. And maybe that's the real reason your brain sometimes rejects big money. It isn't necessarily because you're incapable of becoming wealthy. It may be because wealth asks you to become comfortable with a version of yourself you've never met before. A version that can hold more. A version that can lose something without falling apart. A version that can have more without needing to prove anything. A version that doesn't immediately spend every increase. A version that can look at a large number in a bank account and simply let it sit there. No panic, no guilt, no rush. Just there, growing. And the strange part is, when that becomes normal, something else changes. The money stops feeling like an event. It becomes a tool. That's when big money stops being something your brain has to defend itself from and starts becoming something your brain finally knows how to handle.